everyone, welcome back. Today I'm here with a giant wrap-up discussing all of the books that I read in May, June, July, and August. Well, technically most of the books that I read in those months. There are a few Wiccan books that I read that I'm going to leave off just for time's sake, but I do plan on making some separate videos later that will discuss Wiccan books and any other Wiccan topics that seem interesting, but I want to kind of separate those a bit from the rest of my main content. But even with those that I've set aside, I have 15 books to discuss here. Over the last 4 months, I read a total of 4,785 pages, bringing my monthly total to around 1,200. As you all know I love to do, I have broken these books down into several categories, and the first category I want to talk about is books by Philippa Gregory, and specifically her Cousins War series. This series has 6 books in it, and it flows pretty much directly into Philippa Gregory's Tudor Court series, which has an additional 8 books in it. These are all historical fiction books that follow the War of the Roses, otherwise known as the Cousins War, and sort of just the shifting Game of Thrones, if you will, in England starting in the mid-1400s. Prior to May, I finished the first and second books in the series, and during the past 4 months, I completed an additional 3 books, so I have the third, fourth, and fifth. I will start off with the third book in the series, which is The Lady of the Rivers. This is my favorite book in the series so far. It was the third published, but it's actually the prequel novel to the first book in the series, which is The White Queen. And this book follows the story of Jacquetta, no idea if I'm saying that right, who is the mother of Elizabeth Woodville, aka the White Queen. And this follows Jacquetta's story from about late childhood all the way up until her sort of middle years and the beginning of Elizabeth's story as it takes off in The White Queen. There are several books in this series that follow the lives of women from Jacquetta's family line, and all of these have the most fantastical elements from the series. And that's because Jacquetta's family supposedly can be traced back to a water goddess named Melusina, and all of the women in her family supposedly have magical powers because of this lineage. The story of Melusina and the magical abilities of the women in this family comes up a lot throughout these books. This one is no exception, but this book also brings in a lot of references to tarot, which I found to be a really interesting element, and overall I just enjoyed the journey, I enjoyed the character, and it connected a few of the storylines that were already starting to build up from the first 2 books. And I gave this book 4 stars on Goodreads. Next, I read the 4th book in this series, which is The Kingmaker's Daughter. This book took an interesting turn because the heroine from the first novel, Elizabeth Woodville, is framed as a villain, at least from this protagonist, Anne, from her point of view. Anne herself was not very interesting to me as a character, but she had some fascinating experiences, and much like a bland chip transporting a delicious dip, she kind of served as a vehicle for a lot of other interesting storylines that were going on around her. I will also say that while all of these books highlight a lot of the hardships of living in the 1400s, and especially for women living in the 1400s, this book kicked it up an extra notch with this shocking, horrifying scene of Anne witnessing her sister giving birth on a boat at sea during a storm where the baby wasn't turned the right way, and it was just terrifying. I didn't want to have children before reading this book, but if anyone ever asks me why, I am just going to refer them to this chapter of The Kingmaker's Daughter, because that is one very good example. Which brings us to the 5th book in the series, The White Princess. This book takes place chronologically just after The Kingmaker's Daughter, but it's also jumping back to the Woodville family line because the White Princess, Elizabeth of York, is the daughter of the White Queen, Elizabeth Woodville. Which, side note, 1400s, can we just stop with the names? There's 10 names that they just recycle over and over, and it's very bizarre and confusing. Stop. I ended up giving this book a whopping 2 stars on Goodreads, and I was considering doing a full separate review video for it, but I'm just going to try and sum it up here. First things first is that I need to give a trigger warning for this book because it does involve rape scenes. It takes place early on in the books, and it was very upsetting and unsettling. I assumed, like I'm sure many other people did reading this, that this was included because it was based on some sort of historical evidence that this is a known thing that it happened, especially because it's among the main characters. Not to spoil, but yeah. I did a little research though because it really bothered me, and as it turns out, it's not based on history. The only thing it's based on is the timing of Elizabeth's first child. The baby was born 8 months after she was married, and that is the only thing from which this decision was made, I think, to fictionalize in an awful, awful thing. I wouldn't give a book 2 stars just because it had a rape scene in it, but Gregory then proceeded to create this disturbing Stockholm Syndrome style romance between Elizabeth and Henry, and there was this running theme, this overall message in the book that when you love a man, you have to forgive him for many things. And that comes up in conjunction with this terrible thing that Henry has done, on top of some other terrible things that he's done. But this one, it comes up with specifically. And that I will give 2 stars for, because I am not here for that. That is not something that you just forgive and move on from. That is not something that we just sweep under the rug and say is okay. And I get that this is taking place in the 1400s, but the book is written now, and that message is being written now, and that is not something that we need to include in today's books. And the whole scene didn't have to happen because there's no evidence that it happened, so I don't know why that was deliberately put into these books along with this message. It just boggles my mind that that was the series of decisions that were made. And it's extra upsetting because otherwise Gregory is a wonderful writer. Her fictionalizing of historic events and the small bits of evidence that are available is generally quite clever and captivating. Her characters are interesting and their stories are easy to get invested in. The rest of this book had a wonderful mystery that I really enjoyed. That was a very clever use of historical evidence. And there was this great theme that I think would have stood perfectly well on its own, of being torn between your family from birth versus the family that you're married into, the division of loyalties that Elizabeth was kind of stuck in, and at the same time, she's stuck in the middle of all this stuff and no one will tell her anything, and it's really frustrating from her side. And all of that was great. There was so much to love within this book, and yet within the first 50 pages, it was ruined by this horrific choice to base Henry and Elizabeth's relationship on physical, verbal, and emotional abuse. Now, I should say that while I am obviously extremely upset and disappointed with this particular book in the series, or at least this one decision within this book in the series, the rest of the books, and honestly the rest of this book, were so good that I have still proceeded to pick up the 6th and final book in this series. And as long as I don't get anything resembling this situation again, I do plan on continuing into the Tudor court books, because again, Gregory does just have a really wonderful way of writing, and I'm enjoying learning the history of this time, and seeing these experiences, just minus that. So that's my rambly shortened review on this. Moving on. So earlier this year, I decided to dig into Wicca a bit to see if it was a good fit for me. I've now mentioned this in several of my videos and a bunch online on social media, so possibly no surprise to you all, but it is a good fit, it turns out. And in this process, I have, sorry, loud neighbors are being loud. Over the course of this last few months, I have read a lot of books to sort of figure out what Wicca is about and what that means to me. So here are a few of the books that I read over the last few months. As I mentioned, I'm gonna dig into others later, but this just gives a little bit of an idea. The first book I have is The Green Witch, and this is a little bit more of a coffee table book, partly I say because it has such an adorable cover, and to me it belongs on display, but also it's one that you can kind of flip through quickly, read bits here and there, and it's really cute. It's got some useful bits in it, though. It's not just for show. Technically this is not Wiccan, this is just sort of pagan adjacent, and it's a great book for those who are kind of looking into a more spiritual connection with nature, which tends to go along with Wicca and several forms of paganism. So I would not recommend this if this was your first foray into the world of Wicca, but if you're looking for something supplemental, or if you're into, like I said, getting in touch with nature and spirituality at the same time, I would highly recommend this one. I ended up giving this one 4 stars. As you can see, I've tabbed it up and I've got a few useful bits that I like to work into my life, so it might be worth picking up. And if nothing else, so cute. My next Wiccan read was a bit of a chunky one. This is Wicca for Life by Raymond Buckland. This book has a lot of information in it. It's like almost more of a textbook, if you can kind of get that vibe. But that being said, it's a little bit more geared towards people who practice in a group setting. I picked this one up originally thinking that it was geared more towards solitary practitioners, which was not the case. There is another book that Raymond Buckland wrote. I think it's called Wicca for One, which I also read, and that one was definitely more for solitary practitioners than this one. That being said, I have found some interesting info in it, and if you are the sort that would practice in a group, this might be a great resource for you. I personally find that Raymond Buckland's style and approach to Wicca is a little bit more rigid and stuffy than is my ideal, but at the same time it was very useful information, and like I said, probably more applicable to people in a slightly different situation. I gave this book 3 stars, not because it was written for a group, because I don't think that's really a fair way to rate a book, but just mostly because his writing, like I said, is a little bit stuffy and not really, I think, the most approachable style, but at the same time it was okay. Like, not great, not terrible, it was okay. Next, I have a couple of Wiccan books that I read on Kindle, the first being A Book of Pagan Rituals by Herman Slater. This book I also gave 3 stars, and for similar reasons to the last book by Raymond Buckland. It just had the same sort of rigid, stuffy vibe about it, very traditional, which is fine. It's just not really relatable to me. It just didn't make it a very easy read. This book is also geared a bit more for group settings, so it was very short. I read through it in an evening, and I probably picked out a couple things here or there that stuck out to me, but it's just not one that I see using much in my day-to-day. The other Kindle book I read was Wiccan Magical Deities by Lisa Chamberlain. I gave this book 4 stars, and I thought it was pretty interesting overall. So in my take or understanding of Wicca, there's the belief that our deity, if you will, is the energy that created the universe. So like Big Bang energy is how I look at it. For our own worship or spiritual practice, whatever you want to call that, we tend to take that energy, break it down into smaller bits, and then personify those bits so that we can better relate to it and interact with it. For many people in Wicca, those personified pieces are just the god and goddess, but many other people find that they have an easier time connecting with specific gods or goddesses from other religions. So this book is meant to help you if you are looking for such deities to connect with, and it breaks down many of the pantheons from ancient religions, and it goes through the different gods and goddesses within those pantheons. I don't see any of these deities working their way into my personal practice. I think I'm actually starting to find that I lean more towards that former category where I just break down my energy into a god bit and a goddess bit with a little bit of variation therein. But I did really enjoy reading about all of these deities. I thought it was really interesting to see the histories and these different religions and the way that the pantheons are broken down and sort of the hierarchies within. It's also really interesting and a useful way for me to connect better with the people I know who do take on some of those deities. So overall, it was a really interesting educational read, and I would recommend it if you're in search of a quick look at a lot of deities. Then the final two Wiccan books I have to talk about here are both from the same series, which is Llewellyn's Sabbath Essentials. So a Sabbath is a Wiccan holiday, and this series has a small reference book for each of the holidays. So I've started this new little tradition of buying the Llewellyn Sabbath Essential for that holiday as it approaches. There have been two, as you can see, during the time in which this wrap-up covers. There is another holiday coming up later this month, and I've already got that book on my shelf, so I'm on track. These two are for Midsummer, which happened in June, and Lunasa, which happened in August. I gave both of these books 4 stars. I thought they were really handy references. In each of the books, they go over sort of the history of that holiday, what it meant in more ancient times, what people do to celebrate it now. There are a lot of recipe ideas and different suggestions for rituals and ways that you can celebrate during that particular time of year. And I have just found them very, very helpful as I'm figuring out how I want to celebrate all of these holidays as they're coming up. So if you are looking for a reference on Wiccan holidays or just pagan holidays, this is a great resource. Moving on to the next category, it's about wedding stuff. So over the past few months, Jess and I have been diving into wedding planning. I'm probably going to do a separate video or two if it's of interest. Let me know. Just talking about how that's going and the different things that we're doing and what we're planning and what bumps we've run into and things that I've learned in case anyone out there is recently engaged and is going through similar things. But there are a few books that Jess and I picked up that I have gone through in these last few months just to get some extra ideas and inspiration. I am going to admit up front that the best resource I found through all of this planning is not a book, it is a website, and that is thenot.com. I am such a fan of this website now. They have checklists, they have a timeline, they have a budgeter. It's so good. If you are planning a wedding, please go check them out. However, there were some very good bits in these books, even if they weren't quite up to the standard of this website. The first of these books actually comes from The Knot, and it is The Knot Guide to Wedding Vows and Traditions. I gave this book 4 stars. I actually gave all of these books 4 stars. I feel like it's a very helpful guide, and it's something that I'm probably going to look back into as we're approaching vows. It did kind of get the juices flowing. It's got me brainstorming a bit as I was reading through it, but I expect that I will utilize it more as we get closer to. But seriously, check out the website. Next is a book by Kirsten Palladino called Equally Wed, The Ultimate Guide to Planning Your LGBTQ+ Wedding. So, obvious reasons for buying this. I will say, again, this was a great resource. There's some really good things in it, but I think it's going to be a lot more useful and a lot more applicable for folks who are living in a more conservative area or who are within a more conservative family. A lot of the bits in this book that were there were some things in here that were, I think, more universal. Like there were lists of songs that were all by queer artists. That's great. That's something that everyone can use. But a lot of the information that I think was the most worthwhile were things like how to deal with a transphobic vendor or what to do with homophobia in your family when you're approaching the topic of getting married, how to find vendors that you know are queer friendly, all that kind of stuff that would come up a lot more in those sort of conservative environments. Fortunately, Jess and I live in Portland, which is extremely gay, and both of our families are great and love us and love our relationship, and we have no qualms there. So those parts don't really apply to us because we are in this very awesome, privileged place. But I still think this book is a great resource for those who are in that sort of environment. And I could see how this would be a really, really useful tool for them. So if you are in such a situation, please do look this up because I think it might be helpful. And the final wedding book on my list is this binder book, which is Emily Post's Wedding Planner. And this is the newer version, which was partially written by Peggy Post, who is Emily Post's great-granddaughter-in-law. So kind of far down the list there. But because it's a modernized version, it was less conservative and like strictly traditional, like stodgy kind of stuff than I was expecting. There was a lot more inclusivity. It mentioned gay weddings, it mentioned accessibility, and a lot of things like that I was pleasantly surprised to see. You can see it's more of a workbook format. So as you possibly also saw there, we didn't really fill out the workbook. We're doing more of our stuff online in digital format, but there were a lot of really good resources in this book. It went through a lot of steps and things that you need to consider that we had not considered yet. And actually, they had a list of different song ideas for different parts of your ceremony, and it was from that list that we found our procession song. So there you go. And that brings me to the final miscellaneous catch-all category of a few books that I've read that did not fit into any of these other categories. So the first book was a Kindle book that I read, which is The Mote in God's Eye by Larry Niven, and I already forgot who the other author is. There's another author that co-wrote that book with him, and I don't have it in my notes, so... But this was the final book that we read for this more sci-fi book club, and unfortunately it was a bit of a stinker. I'm not a big fan of Larry Niven after reading Ringworld, because while admittedly there's some great world building, there's also a lot of sexism, and that opinion I had was nothing but solidified after reading The Mote in God's Eye. There was just way too much sexism and toxic masculinity, even considering the fact that this is a vintage science fiction book. It was just way too much, and it was everywhere. I would have given this book 2 stars because of all of that. I bumped it up to 3 because, like Ringworld, I begrudgingly must admit that the world building in this book is epic. Very well done. That is like the ultimate strength of Larry Niven is world building. He's fantastic at that. Everything else, kind of trash in my opinion. So yeah, I give that one 3 stars. Not one that I will highly recommend, but at least I can say I read it. And I want to give a big thanks to everyone who has supported the podcast over the last few years. The several podcasts that I worked on with Adrian, we had a really great ride. We were just getting way too overwhelmed and a little bit burnt out, so this was just the time to stop. So our episodes will still be up on our website for the next, I think, through the rest of the year, or for a year, for some amount of months it's going to be up. So if you're curious to listen to any of our past episodes, you can go and do so, and eventually our site will run out of its funding and we will shut that down. Then I also read Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb, which is the 4th and final book in her Chronicle, Rainwild Chronicles series. This book was difficult for me to rate. The Rainwild Chronicles have not been my favorite of Hobb's series, and I think that's because it was turned into 4 books. I've heard this repeated amongst other booktubers. It just felt kind of forced, and that especially came through during the 3rd book. This fourth book I felt started much stronger. There was a lot more plot progression happening. There was less agonizing over the same relationship issues that we just beat our heads against a wall about in the third book. And there was a lot more being revealed about the Elderlings and the dragons, which was great. In true Hob form, I saw the threads weaving together for that beautiful final tapestry to be revealed. But then, just at the very end, right at the climax of the story, it kind of just fell apart. It kind of gave me that feeling of like when you forget that the deadline on a project is tomorrow and you suddenly remember the night before and you just have to sit down and bust out something so that you have something to present tomorrow. I loved the actual plot of what happened. There just was no meat to it. It wasn't fleshed out. It just kind of like, it happened, and then like flash forward and it happened. And I just really wish that we would have seen it unfold after all of this time that we spent building up to that moment. Had the end of this book been fleshed out and written in her normal, amazing, magical style, easily it would have been a 5-star read for me. Because that very end just took a weird turn, I docked off a star. I'm giving this one 4 stars. Still, I would read pretty much anything that Robin Hobb wrote, especially within this world. I love it so much. Just that little bit of sadness at the end. And at last, the final book in this giant wrap-up that I have decided to do for some reason is a Kindle book by Lois McMaster Bujold. This is the latest book in her Penric and Desdemona series of novellas, and it is called The Orphans of Raspe. The Penric novellas are like candy to me. I love the characters of Pin and Des so much that being on another adventure with them and sort of feeling like we're all back together again, it just is automatically fun for me regardless of what's happening. So I loved being back into this world, but I will say that I found this story to be a little lackluster compared to some of the previous novellas. There were definitely some really fun parts, and as always, like I said, I just love these characters and I love seeing them together and their interactions. But I did feel like the way it ended was a little bit too convenient. Like I saw it coming. And then I thought, no, she wouldn't do that. But then she did. And so it just felt a little bit too perfect. And the epilogue didn't wrap things up quite the way that I'd hoped. So for those reasons, I took off a star and I gave this one 4 stars. But again, I'm kind of biased. So it would be hard for me to go below a 4-star for any of these books, I think. We made it. It's the end. So thank you all so much for going through this journey with me. Those are all of the books that I read during May, June, July, and August. Not as bad as it could have been, but still there was a lot there, I know, so thank you if you watched this whole video. I will have a TBR for September coming soon, so stay tuned for that. Let me know down in the comments what you have been reading lately. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? If so, let's chat. And thank you all again so much for watching. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe if you'd like to see more. I hope you all are having a wonderful week so far, and I will talk to you soon. Bye!